I'd like to thank you for joining this webinar, Practical Approaches to the CFPB. My name is John McNamara, and I'm a 30-year veteran of the ARM industry, accounts receivable management, if anybody's not from that space, and I'm currently the Chief Marketing Officer for LiveVox. Prior to LiveVox, I was Senior Vice President of Banking and Retail Operations for the Collections Division of First Data Corporation. I've also been a former Chief Operating Officer for a fairly large agency. And I've served as Compliance Officer and Head of Training and Quality in my 30 years in the space. After all this time, I'd just like to say that I think I thought I'd seen it all, but I have to admit the CFPB is presenting our industry with an entirely new set of challenges and certainly an unprecedented level of uncertainty. The one thing that I do know for sure about the CFPB is that it's here to stay, and regardless of your firm's size, whether you're an agency or a creditor, if you do collections, the Bureau is changing the landscape in which you operate. The other uncertainty is this, that they're 3 for 3 on punitive or consumer redress actions with the creditors they visited. Capital One, it amounted to $210 million. Discover Card, $214 million. American Express, $112.5 million. I've had the pleasure of working consumer debt for all the 3 above-mentioned institutions, and I know them to be highly focused and dedicated to collections compliance. They always have been in all my interactions with them. Very professional, very serious organizations as far as protecting the consumer. But if firms with such a well-established compliance management system were so impacted, what about agencies that might be just getting around to amping up their compliance focus? There are many, many compliance webinars and training sessions out there right now, but I wanted the viewers today to get ideas that they can put to use immediately. And actually, I attended a session that Judy Hammond's company put on some months ago. It was an on-site seminar about the CFPB, and that really got me thinking about an idea, and I approached Judy about it. But what I wanted to do, like the creditors I mentioned earlier, nearly everyone in the ARM space is conscientious about compliance. But how could they, like the creditors above, believe they're in good shape, but still might have gaps that hurt them when the CFPB comes calling? And that's really the purpose of today's webinar. If you'll move to the next slide. On today's call, I've got the great pleasure of having the folks from RMS, Judy Hammond and Bev Avancic. I can't say enough good things about RMS, and I've always seen them as the go-to source for audit and agency management. They are, I'm going to talk a little bit about RMS, and if they want to add more later, but they're one of the financial service industry's highest regarded accounts receivable consultants and a widely recognized leader and innovator in the collection and recovery industry. In addition to consulting services, RMS provides education and networking opportunities such as Debt Connection, CRS, and DCS. As I said earlier, I'm from LiveVox. LiveVox is a premier provider of cloud contact solutions through a PCI DSS certified platform that integrates dialer, ACD, IVR, soft phone, and call recording. I've spent most of my adult life in the contact center operations world, and I never thought I'd wind up working for a vendor. I was an unpaid evangelizer for LiveVox before I joined them. I was drawn by the bursting flexibility and skills-based routing. That flexibility continues to be crucial as we help clients with this uncertain compliance landscape. And basically at this point, I really want to be quiet and introduce folks who have the content for today's session. So I'm extremely delighted to announce that we have from RMS, Judy Hammond and Bev Avancic. And if you don't know these folks by now, Judy and Bev, if you'd like to join in and maybe explain a little bit about your background.
Thanks, John. This is Bev Avancic, and unfortunately, I have quite a few years of experience in the collection industry. I'd like to say that I started when I was about 5 years old in the industry, but I started as a collector and worked my way up. I was originally in a retail side of it, then went to AT&T Universal Card and Citibank as well. And then I joined Judy Hammond and Resource Management Services in 1994. So that's a little bit about myself. Judy?
This is Judy Hammond. I originally in 80-something, the early 80s, went to work for I worked for 2 collection agencies before I started my own business, and we've certainly had the opportunity to go in and audit quite a few collection agencies, attorney firms, as well as inside the creditor shop. And so hopefully today we can bring some of that background to give you some ideas on what you can do in today's environment.
Okay, and a few disclosures before we get started. First of all, RMS is not a law firm. None of this is intended as legal advice, and RMS is not an employee or a client of LiveVox.
Thanks, John. First of all, we want to just briefly go over the state of the market with the CFPB involved. First of all, they are going to have jurisdiction over virtually all consumer financial activities with all service providers, and we'll get into a little more information with that in a moment. They are going to have a lot of power, and the penalties are going to be extensive. As far as the debt collectors go, the larger participant rule was recently identified and defined for us. And we're also going to go over the state of the market as far as the compliance management systems and complaint response system that the CFPB is going to require you to have, or at least expect you to have. So I'm just going to go over a little bit about the background of the CFPB. According to the CFPB website, the central mission of the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is to make markets for consumer financial products and services work for Americans, whether they are applying for a mortgage, choosing among credit cards, or using any number of other consumer financial products. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010 established the Consumer Bureau. In January of 2012, President Obama appointed Rich Cordray to be the first director of the CFPB. Prior to being the director of the CFPB, Rich Cordray was Ohio's Attorney General. And if you have done any research on Rich's background as the Ohio Attorney General, he was well known for protecting consumers against financial predators. So he has a lot of knowledge as far as the financial community goes. The debt collection industry they're really accustomed to the FTC and its enforcement of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act. The FTC actually has very limited authority and does not have jurisdiction over banks and credit unions. And that's where a lot of you, if you're a bank or a credit union, you had outside enforcement through through the OCC, for example. The FTC has limited authority, and the Dodd-Frank has a broad authority over banks and credit unions and virtually any other company that provides financial products and services to consumers, as well as any third-party vendors of the companies that provide financial products and services to consumers. And what that means is that also the CFPB is going to have authority over debt buyers, collection agencies, collection attorneys, and any of their vendors as well, which could include, for example, letter vendors or skip tracing companies that you're using. So the CFPB has a broad range of authority. And going back to the FTC, one of the largest settlements with the FTC that I can remember was in 2011 for $2.8 million against West Asset Management. Just to give you some perspective of how massive the CFPB is, they actually have powers with penalties up to $1 million per day. So their power is a lot more than the FTC ever had. And then on October 24th, the CFPB released a definition of larger participants of consumer debt collection. And just in case you have not been on their website, the CFPB examination procedures for debt collection may be found at www.consumerfinance.gov. And it's very interesting to go on there and at least kind of get an understanding of what the CFPB is going to be looking for during their examinations. As far as the agency side goes, we don't know what that is going to entail at this point. We only have some of the information through the examination procedures. One thing to bring out is, according to the CFPB examination procedure, a non-bank covered person is a larger participant of the consumer debt collection market if the person's annual receipts resulting from consumer debt collection, as defined in the rule, are more than $10 million. But here is my definition of the larger participant rule. Every debt buyer, debt collection agency, and debt collection attorney may be subject to a CFPB examination. And all of your vendors as well may be receiving a CFP examination. One of the CFPB's primary roles is to identify potential risks to consumers. In my opinion, this means that you need to invest time, energy, and money into recruiting and training an impartial compliance management team. This may mean that your owners are not necessarily the best qualified to look at your compliance. And my other recommendation at this point, unfortunately, is if you are not able or willing to spend the time, money, and energy to actually hire a compliance team, then you may want to consider getting out of the debt collection business altogether. I'm going to briefly just go over what to expect during a CFPB exam. Before the CFPB comes on site, they're going to ask you for a lot of information, such as all of your written procedures, incentive programs, telephone reports, productivity reports, telephone recordings, and a lot more. When the CFPB comes on site, expect them to bring a team of people, including auditors, and at least one or more attorneys. They are going to look at every aspect of your business. They are going to conduct side-by-side sessions with collectors and supervisors. They're going to review your calling strategy. They're going to sit with managers to understand what the process is in your business. This means that you need to have your collectors and supervisors and managers trained for side-by-side sessions with the CFPB officials. And make sure you have discussed with your attorney whether they want you to have representation prior to the audit. Part of our auditing program with Resource Management Services is to complete side-by-side sessions with collectors. And I'm going to tell you, it's always an eye-opening experience. The collectors are very comfortable with me because I'm not intimidating. A lot of them, they talk to me like I'm their mom. I'm not the client, not their manager. So I vent to them, and they're very quick to tell me, how things are really done. For example, I'll give you one example during a side-by-side session. And before I give the example, I recognize that some of the agencies that I have actually audited are on the phone today. None have been viewed in just one agency. They've been viewed in many. So if you happen to have had this feedback from me before, this is not necessarily about your agency. This is where I've seen, unfortunately, at multiple agencies. So, for example, during one on-site visit side-by-side session, the collector told me that the client wasn't good at giving them secondary location information. And the agency actually gave them limited access to the Internet. So the collector, thinking he was doing the right thing, took the account information home and actually Googled the information at home so that they could get location information for the secondary person. And unfortunately, the collector thought he was doing the right thing, but it resulted in private information being taken off site. And according to the examination procedures, one of the objectives is to assess the quality of regulated entities' compliance management systems, including its internal controls and policies and procedures for its debt collection business. So I'm going to go through 5 common mistakes that I have seen during the course of many years of auditing and how to avoid them. The 5 common mistakes all deal with the CFPB's objectives of compliance management. The 5 common mistakes that I have identified deal with recording and call monitoring procedures, fees, incentive plans, complaint management, and managed dial. Keep in mind as we go through the 5 common mistakes that the CFPB's focus is on the risk to consumers, not the risk to your profitability, but the risk to consumers. The CFPB is going to review your internal controls, and this starts with the written procedures for every process in your business. And I can't tell you how many times we've reviewed the written procedures and found that they were actually updated in 1996. So I suspect that those procedures are no longer valid. So they're going to start with the written procedures. And as you know, you may have the best written procedure process in place, but it does not mean that collectors and supervisors and managers follows the written procedures 100% of the time. The CFPB is going to review the internal controls in place to ensure compliance of written procedures. You will hear this suggestion throughout the hour, and that is the best way to ensure compliance is, first of all, hire a compliance officer. and a compliance team that does not report to the collection organization. Have legal counsel available that is knowledgeable about debt collection and the CFPB. Review work effort completed on accounts. Monitor a lot of calls. You think you've monitored enough calls? Monitor some more. The next thing is have an impartial person complete side-by-side sessions with collectors. I've found that many times the supervisors are rather intimidating, and collectors tell them what they want to hear instead of actually how they're working the accounts. And the last thing is document all results and provide feedback to the collectors. The first area we're going to start with is call recording. I recommend that you start by reviewing your call recording policy. First of all, do you have a written call recording policy? If you do have a written procedure, when was the last time that it was updated, and who is responsible for updating the procedure? And also, how do you communicate the updated procedures and ensure people understand the procedure? Now, I am not going to tell you what your call recording policy should be. That's up to you. But I am some things that I site visits that reflect the call recording policies. First of all, I recommend that you have a written call recording policy and a team responsible for reviewing the procedures and ensuring that the written policies are accurate. I'm going to go through several areas that I think you should review to ensure your policies and procedures minimize the risk to consumers. First of all, what are the exceptions to your call recording policy? Do you record all calls, including transfer and manager calls? What calls are exempt, such as the 12 two-party states? They have some requirements for both parties to know that the call is being recorded. And if you do exempt the 12 two-party states, how do you ensure that all of the area codes are included in the exemption? Area codes change quite frequently, so you need to make sure you have procedures and update the area codes exempted from being recorded. Do you depend on collectors to deactivate the recording in those states? If so, how do you ensure that they deactivate it on every call? I've been on several audits. The agency does not record calls in the two-party states. However, when I request calls in two-party states, I have actually received them, which means that they obviously are being recorded. The problem with that is, in many cases, the collectors did not provide the recorded line message to the consumer because they assumed it was not being recorded. So even if you have a written policy, you need to make sure that it's actually working. Another consideration is with the cell phones. If you have any collectors, supervisors, or managers, they have company-issued cell phones, you need to understand how you track calls being made to and from the cell phone. And I had one case where the collection manager was giving the consumers his cell phone number, and he was actually setting up dates with the consumers after the fact. So you really do need to understand, what calls are being made and taken on the cell phone, the company-issued cell phones. Another area to consider is, do you record transfer calls? And this includes calls transfer between collectors as well as the escalated calls from collectors and supervisors. Unfortunately, I've had cases where it was a supervisor or manager that was inappropriate to the consumer. So I personally like to have all of those calls as well recorded. And then do you record the manager line? I know some agencies in particular, they have some concerns about recording the manager line because of personal calls being made on there and perhaps some human resource concerns. But again, that's, the manager's calls sometimes are very eye-opening in what they're doing with the consumers and how they're communicating. And then also about, do you record calls that go to collectors and managers' voicemail, or is it that once the message is deleted, the actual recording is deleted? And if that's the case, do you have a tracking system to know what calls and accounts are attached to the customers that actually left a voicemail?
Bev, this is...
And Judy, do you have anything to add on the actual recording exceptions?
Yeah, Bev, this is Judy. We also had a question on what is a two-party state, and just make a point here that there are 12 different states that require both the person who generates the call and the person who is on the call to know that the call is being recorded. So you have to identify that, and they're often referred to as two-party states. And also her point about area codes exempt from recording. Because there are 12 of these states, many people try to take out certain area codes that might be in those states. But what we've seen on the Internet is these area codes can change every 3 weeks or so. So you have to really keep up with it. So your all of your policies regarding if I'm going to record, if I'm not going to record, are important to kind of know about these 12 states. And basically, you need to tell those people you're recording. California, for example, is one of them. You need to start with the call with either on a recorded line or this call is being recorded, which you hear a lot.
Hey, Judy?
Yes.
Just also a comment, and this is food for thought. That's what this webinar is designed to do, is give you food for thought. It's not unreasonable to expect the CFPB in a two-party state to want the agent side of that call and a record of that. You might not be able to record the consumer, but they may want to make sure that they hear that the agent didn't say anything they shouldn't have. And then the other observation I've got is the CFPB, I think they're well over 1,000 employees. These are very, very intelligent people. They can't help but to make comparisons as they move from one agency to another. Each agency audit will make them smarter, and it's going to basically set their expectations. I think gaps in recording and lack of recording might be perceived as a lack of transparency, and I think that's a concern for folks as you make your call recording policy decisions.
Thanks, John. And we had another point, and that is, what if the address is in the state but the cell phone isn't? And I think on this call we're not going to tell you how you need to do this, because you may want to get representation from a legal person on whether you're going to record based on the states and that. Back to you, Beth.
Then you have to make sure that you identify that the call has been recorded, even if it's to a consumer that is not in a two-party state. So there are a lot of rules and regulations around that, and I highly recommend that you get your attorney involved when you decide what calls you are going to exempt from call recording. The next thing with call recording is how long you're going to keep the call recordings, and if there are any exceptions to how long you're going to keep the call recording, such as, are you going to keep it longer if you had a Better Business Bureau complaint? And also, who has the ability to delete the recordings? I'm going to share with you one case I was on where there was a Better Business Bureau complaint, and the answer appeared that there, at that time, was a call recording that was reviewed by the agency. However, when I asked for the call a short time later, which was actually less than 2 weeks after the agency replied to the Better Business Bureau, they were not able to provide the call to me. So that could be for many different reasons. It could be that the call recording never existed. However, they responded like it did. It may be that someone deleted it, or many other scenarios. So you do have to understand what your recording retention is going to be, and who has access to that, and who can delete that. Another area that's gaining more and more attention is the electronic fund transfer, or phone pays and debit cards. And the regulations for that, they're actually spelled out in Regulation E. And you have to decide how long you're going to keep the calls when the consumer has authorized an electronic fund transfer or phone pay or debit card. And if you're going to do it separately, because the customer does have to give you permission for the one-time payment. In addition to the one-time payment, there's also some conditions in Reg E customers that give you permission for multiple payments, phone pays. So, for example, if you get a 6-month arrangement and you do the post dates out there for 6 months, it appears that the Regulation E requirement is that you get written permission from the customer to allow you to continue taking those multiple payments out. And it does appear that may be through email as well as through written notice. So you have to understand what you're going to do with your phone pays or your EFTs and your debit cards in particular, and make sure that Reg E is taken into consideration when you set up your procedure for that. The other thing is, how do you know or identify if there are problems with the call recording system? There are many times that I request calls for a sample, and it's well within the written guidelines of their procedures, but the call is not available. And a lot of times it's because the call recording system actually went down. So you need to make sure you have someone that is going to be monitoring that and logging that so that you know what calls have been impacted. And you have to come up with your action plan, because, I request minimal calls, and I get that all the time. So it kind of leads me to believe that it's more of a problem or issue for agencies than we really know. And then another consideration on the call recording is how you're going to handle it if the customer requests not to be recorded. So we want to know, is the call then transferred to a non-recorded line, or does the collector have the option to deactivate the recording, or is the call terminated? And one thing to keep in mind is if the collector is responsible for deactivating the call, there's room for error if it's not a system way of making sure that it's not recorded. So you have to keep that in mind. And then the other thing is, I've listened to many calls where the consumer requests that a call is not recorded. However, I'm able to get the call because it has been recorded. So you do need to make sure that those procedures are in place and being followed. And then the last thing to look at is the recording storage and where the recordings, in particular, what safeguards are in place to ensure that personal identifiable information is protected. And what about the calls that have bank account and credit card information on them? How are they stored, and how do you ensure that that information is not released or available to people that don't need the information? And then when the recordings are requested by clients, what are the safeguards around additional copies of account data and possible credit card or checking account information? So, as you're sending call recordings to your clients, for example, if they've requested them, who has access to that, and where are you storing that, and how do you make sure that that information is safe, the private information is safe? And then Judy and John, do you have anything else on the actual call recording piece of it?
I think you're going to talk later about manual, but I heard someone, it was at one of the recent seminars on CFPB preparation, and they said something that really stuck, and I think it's important, so important that I want to share it with everybody on this call. And they said the old standard of compliance was to have a compliance policy. The new standard of compliance, and this is how you should take a look at your operations, is prove to me you have a compliance policy, but also more importantly, prove to me that it works. For example, can someone go out on your contact center floor, collection floor, can they go out and actually make a call that isn't recorded? And I jokingly was talking to an agency owner, and I said, talk to your manager who likes to make a lot of personal calls, and I guarantee they have found a way to make calls that are not recorded. And if they know about it, then other agents know about it, and you have a very serious compliance gap.
John, we've got an interesting question here. Should a recording already be begun when a party requests not to be recorded? Should that be deleted, or should the aborted recording be retained to show that the recording was terminated, kind of like your prove to me you did it?
Wow. That's a good question above my pay grade.
What do you think, Bev?
I was going to say that actually I would have to say I would have to refer that to an attorney on that, because if part of it was recorded, I can see both sides of that. If part of it were recorded, then you don't want to deny that it was recorded. I guess my advice would actually be make sure your collectors are immediately identifying that it's on a recorded line. And that, by the way, as far as telling someone it's a recorded line, it's not just consumers. If you talk to a third party, they also are supposed to know that it's on a recorded line. So to get the collectors into identifying that it's on a recorded line right from the get-go. So I don't have an answer to the actual question, but I will say just make sure your collectors do that as their first priority on the phone call.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just to add one little thing, I see that a lot. People who record calls, they all the time it's in their talk-offs, but when it's in their third-party discussions, they don't always mention it. So it's a great point.
Yeah, I guess if I were
Right.
going to decide among the lesser of two evils, I think I'd rather have the calls and maybe face I guess I'd rather prove transparency to the CFPB probably than anything else on those. But again, that's definitely a question for your attorney. And it's also a personal business risk decision, I think, for folks to make.
Right. The call monitoring program, it definitely goes hand in glove with your complaint management. It's critical to have a documented call monitoring program, and also an unbiased team responsible for listening to the calls and providing results to the collectors. So this means that it may not, or actually I would say cannot solely rely on the collection supervisors and managers to monitor your calls. Ideally, you will have a compliance team and collection managers monitoring calls. It's also important to have a documented training program and have the compliance team and collection managers complete the actual training program. The compliance team and collection managers are also going to need to have calibration sessions to ensure the consistency of the actual call monitoring. And there are a couple of reasons I say that. During site visits, I found that collection managers don't always have the time required to complete formal call monitoring sessions. And a lot of times they tell me, oh, well, I don't need to do the call monitoring because I handle all these calls live and I'm right on the floor and I'm helping them. You know, the problem with that is that the sessions aren't documented. In many cases, the supervisor takes the calls at the collector's desk, and then they end up not even noting the account. So then we don't even know that the supervisor was involved with the account. So with your call monitoring, you have to make sure that it is a formal program, and it cannot solely be the collection manager or supervisor responsible for the call management. And then we look at the call, and we call monitoring, we look at the number of calls. In many cases, I found that the collection supervisors, they typically monitor 2 or 3 calls per month, and the call monitoring group probably monitors between 2 to 5 calls a month. You know, so at max, the collectors would have 8 calls monitored. So if you look at the number of calls monitored versus the number of calls dialed, it's probably a very small percent. My point in the beginning of the presentation, and that is, you know, your call monitoring, I would say monitor calls, and you would say, oh my gosh, I've already monitored enough. I say monitor more. The more you monitor, the better. You just, you know, a minimal amount of like 8 calls monitored is not going to necessarily give you the whole picture. And the other thing is, you know, as far as collection supervisors on their list of to-dos, the call monitoring is not necessarily the test. You know, so I've seen cases where the collection managers and supervisors, they just don't have time to do the call monitoring. So then they find ways to be able to make the number happen. So if they're supposed to, you know, actually monitor 2 calls, then they, you know, they take the non-contact calls because they're shorter calls. Or in one case, I actually had the director's supervisor, and they were selecting which ones should be monitored for the month. You know, so you have to watch that and make sure. That's why I recommend that you have a dedicated team to your compliance and call monitoring, because that then is their sole function, and is strictly just to do call monitoring. And then the other thing is, in the call monitoring, you want to look at the type of calls that you actually monitor. I have some agencies that like to just monitor contacts, and I would say you want to monitor a whole bunch of different types of scenarios, including left messages and contacts with third parties. Actually, the left messages I have found the most creative use of collectors' time. So I like to, you know, get a lot of different scenarios in my call monitoring sample. And you know, when we do call monitoring, I like to get my sample from a lot of different places, like telephone reports. And, you know, the telephone report, it has every number that was attempted. And there's a couple things I do with that. I can actually look at the number of times that telephone number was attempted and compare it to the account to make sure all of the, you know, all of the attempts have been documented on the account. So I like to get it from the telephone reports. I also review accounts and look at the notes on the accounts. And the good news is typically the collectors, they note exactly what they say. And unfortunately, that's also the bad news, is they like to note exactly what they say. So I also go through account notes and see if there are any calls that may be of interest to monitor. And another area I get them from is from the return payment report, and particularly if the return reason is unauthorized. And there are a lot of cases where I have found that when I pulled those calls, it was consumer really wanted to mail a payment, and the collector strongly encouraged them to do a pay by phone. So then when the consumer had time to think about it, they went to their bank real quick and made sure that the payment was noted as unauthorized in return. So I like to pull them from the return payment report as well, so I can make sure that, you know, the collectors are working the accounts effectively. I also like to review calls from the call transfer report. Because in some cases the first collector's call ended in what I like to term some attitude, and so they transfer to either a second collector or they transfer to a supervisor. And, you know, I like to make sure that the same attitude is not being pursued by the supervisor or the second voice. So I also get them from transfer calls. And then the other thing to consider is, how you're going to monitor your non-English speaking calls. A lot of the agencies that I visit, the call monitoring team does not have a bilingual team member, and especially, with some of the demographics of your accounts, you need to make sure they are able to monitor the calls that are in those populations. And then another thing I like on the call monitoring is score it. I like to score it between legal concerns and efficiency concerns. So some legal issues are going to be, did they correctly identify the customer? Did they identify themselves and why they were calling? Did they provide the mini Miranda? I also have a score on what I like to term collector fabrication in the legal compliance. And what that is, for example, maybe some misspoken or mistruths that the collector has identified. For example, I hear on calls, my client only accepts ACH payments, when we know that's not true. They accept mail-in payments. They accept all different types of payments. So we want to make sure that they are not fabricating the story or giving some mistruths with that. Another legal issue is, for inappropriate messages. So if there are any accounts that have any potential legal concerns on it, it's an automatic fail of the call monitoring. And then the next group I look at is the efficiency category, and that's, are they negotiating the payment? Are they updating location information? And then one last reminder on the call monitoring is some systems, we found that the timestamp on systems varies greatly. Some systems note the time as the server time zone. Some are the dialer time zone. Some are where the collector is based. So you have to really understand your timestamp on your system to know when you're monitoring to ensure that it's within the FDCPA guidelines.
Yeah, this is Bev and Judy. This is, I think, a very good one to talk about.
Fees. First of all, I highly recommend that you review your fee structure, and ensure that you have written procedures in place on your fee structure. And with fees, what I mean are payment fees, receipt fees, or any additional fees that you charge a customer. I think you need to review all of those. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of some fee structures that I think may be worth looking into. And one of those is the fact that I particularly have one client that doesn't allow fees to be charged. Then I have many other clients that allow fees to be charged. So I go to the same agencies, and they're doing the same work, incurring the same exact cost, and yet the one client that doesn't allow fees has no fees, and the other clients have all different types of fees being charged, different amounts. So my first consideration would be, how is that going to look when we have such a wide variety of fees being assessed on an account in different amounts? I like to say if it gives the eyebrow raise when I'm sitting, with a side-by-side session and the collector identifies what types of fees are accounts. If I raise my eyebrows, then I think, that may be something that is not necessarily how the agency intended it to be. So I strongly encourage you to look at your fee structure and understand when you're assessing them, when you're waiving them, who has the ability to waive them. So some systems, for example, there are some states that don't allow you to charge a phone pay fee. And, so I've seen some systems that automatically flag the account and prohibit it from being incurred on the account. It's supposed to be the collector's responsibility to ensure that those fees are not assessed. So, in those cases, whenever the collector is responsible for stopping the fee from happening, there's a good chance there's going to be an error on that.
Good points.
And John and Judy, do you want to add some more on the fees?
The point I would make is the CFPB is going to be a learning organization. And again, if it goes to two different agencies, one charges a fee, one doesn't for the same client, they have to ask themselves why. So if there are fees being charged, it's probably a good idea that you would need to make an economic case that you do it. So that's why when Judy, Bev, when you guys put this presentation together, when you brought up fees, I thought, again, it's a great example where you think you might be doing the right thing. You've been doing this for a long time, but you need to take a very, very good look at yourself and ask, try to look at yourself through the eyes of the CFPB and ask yourself some hard questions.
And another thing with the fee structure is that, for example, there are many agencies that charge a fee for credit cards if the collector actually takes the credit card payment, where they don't charge the fee if the customer goes on their website and enters the credit card information. So another thing to keep in mind is you need to understand how that impacts different groups of people. So, for example, if you do not charge a fee if the customer enters it on the website, what about customers that don't have access to a computer? Are you negatively impacting them simply because they don't have access to a computer? So it's not just the fees that you need to look at. It's why you're charging them, when do you waive them, and if you're negatively impacting specific groups of people, and determine if that's in your best interest to do that. And another area is that there are a couple agencies that have relationships with debt management companies, and they specifically refer customers to specific debt management companies, and they get a kickback on that. Understand that and determine if that is what you want to do for your business. I went on one audit where the company referred customers to a particular refinance company, and the only reason they referred them to that company was because the collection manager's spouse worked there. So you need to understand your fees and with your relationships with other companies that are assessing fees or doing work with you. You need to understand if that is what you want to do for your business, if it's in the best interest of all customers. When I got in the collection business, all we worried about was dollars collected. And there's some agencies that still, that's their only goal on their incentive plan. And particularly with the CFPB, you have to understand that they're looking at consumer risk. So it's not just the dollars collected, but it is the customer satisfaction. I actually have one agency that asked on the call, how did I do? What could I have done better? And it's amazing the response that the consumers are giving, because they're actually giving very good feedback to them and, thanking them for their service. So I would highly recommend that your incentive programs not be based solely on dollars collected, but you also add the customer delight or the customer satisfaction portion from your call monitoring.
This is a full several-day seminar, right, Bev?
It is, and that is your complaint management. And I'm going to throw out that I'm very conservative on the complaint management. When I go into an agency and I ask for their complaint log and I get one complaint, or my favorite is when they tell me, oh, that client never gets any complaints. Then I have to wonder, why is it that you don't have any complaints? And in many cases, it's because of the definition of a complaint. And, we as an industry spend a lot of time determining what a complaint is. But my personal opinion is, with the CFPB in particular, is that any time a call is escalated, it could be considered a complaint. And those calls need to be logged and tracked, and feedback needs to be provided to the collectors to make sure that it doesn't get escalated any further than that. So I do take a very conservative approach on it. And I do believe you need a dedicated staff of unbiased teams, which means that it cannot be your collection staff that's responsible for responding to the escalated calls and the complaints. It needs to be someone that is able to step away from the situation and determine if there were things that could have been done better to make that call go more effectively and efficiently. And it's kind of like the one-stop shopping. We do want the customer, in many cases you're not going to have the opportunity to get the customer back on the line. So we do want to make that first call resolution a priority. And that first call resolution will not happen if you are elevating your voice or, you're fighting with the customer. So I'm very conservative on it, and I think any time that a call is escalated, it is actually considered a complaint and a learning opportunity and a training opportunity. So I personally recommend that you register all of those complaints and log them. And I also recommend that you have a lot of different methods that the customer can actually contact you to discuss the accounts or how it was handled. And, that comes from you escalate a call to an easy call transfer so that someone's available right then to take the call. You may have an email, them set up. They can also send in concerns through an email or internet access. So I think they need a lot of different ways to be able to get and discuss their account and discuss how it was handled. And someone needs to be there to immediately get back with them, investigate what happened on the account and give a response to the customer as well as the collector. And I'm not saying that every time a call is escalated that the customer is always right. It's not a point of who's right or wrong. It's a point of as soon as it is escalated, it is a potential complaint, and you as a business need to deal with that.
And actually, Bev, I'm going to talk a little bit about manual calls as well, because I think the fact that you brought this up as an area of concern is definitely a big one. And we hear it from our customers as well.
And my quick point with the manual call is that in many cases, the telephone system does not allow them. It actually allows, it allows them to make calls out of the time zone because it's in a manual mode. And I can't tell you how many side-by-sides I've been on where the collector was supposed to be the one responsible for understanding what time zone it's in. It's not going to happen. Collectors have a lot on their plate, and adding that to it is very difficult. And there are many cases where they dial accounts that are outside of the time zone, and particularly the states, for example, Indiana, some of them go into daylight savings time and some don't. It's very difficult to keep up with all that, and I really don't think the collectors can ever keep up with it. So on the manual call, I would highly recommend that you review that and make sure that it's not the collector responsible for actually knowing what time zone it is and when they can dial and when they can't dial.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thanks, Bev. Appreciate it. Good stuff. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit more because it is an area of risk. But listen, if you guys are like me, you're thinking, okay, great. There's a lot of demands I have to make. I have a business to run. How do I get there? The CFPB may demand these changes, but I wonder if they have any consideration for just how difficult and costly they are. They don't really. They expect the entry level for compliance. They expect a certain level of compliance, and saying that you can't do it or it's too expensive, that won't fly. If you can move to the next slide. All right. Let me warn you about the next few slides, folks. And again, thanks for sticking with us. If you're not an IT person, these may hurt your eyes a little bit. If you're a compliance or an operation executive, it's really critical that you take a look. In the next few slides, traditional hardware-based contact centers are diagrammed on the left, cloud solutions on the right. If the hardware network looks complicated and you're thinking that to yourself, well, you're exactly right. It looks complicated and it is complicated. Bev and Judy have outlined some of the issues that CFPB compliance presents, and there's no doubt the challenges are substantial. Cloud technology has evolved to the point that it makes several of these big challenges a heck of a lot easier to tackle. Consider the picture on the left. Okay, much simpler. If you look at the one on the right, it explains why it's hard to add new services. Again, if you look on the left side here, traditional network, that's why it's hard to bring up new services, new sites, roll out compliance rules across the company, and be assured that those are going to be followed. There are many points of connection, many points that need to be integrated. These diagrams, the one on the right, traditional network, are standard for virtually all IT installations. It's not your IT staff fault that it looks like that. It's not that they wanted it to be complicated. It was their only choice. When you can't get a warm and fuzzy that you have 100% call recording or the new penetration settings are in place system-wide, it's not bad IT, it's traditional design. Small changes require lots of complex work. That takes time, money, and it's prone to mistakes. Now, if you look on the right, the primary themes behind cloud technology include simplification, unification, centralized control, and cost efficiency. When you're trying to drive changes across the multi-site contact center environment quickly and cost effectively, these capabilities are absolutely vital. Okay, so if you're like me, you're an ops guy at heart, what does that mean? Let me give you a few examples as it relates to compliance and some of the things we just talked about. The first one is managing manual dials. We've talked about exception gaps on manual calls, and Bev, I'm terribly sorry, but we kind of rushed you on that one. But manual calls typically seem to be forgotten when it comes to call recording or the dialing compliance rules, as you mentioned with the time zone settings. Manually dialed campaigns typically occur on the PBX that exist on a completely separate piece of hardware, one that's typically not fully integrated into the collection management system, the ACD, or the dialer. The consequence of not integrating the PBX into the other applications leaves businesses with the inability to apply key compliance controls over these calls, such as time zone restrictions, phone and account penetration level settings. Not to mention the inability to effectively match the call recordings to the account. You know, in the brave new world post-CFPB, all accounts need to be indexed and accessible when you ask for them. You know, very simply, if your voice data exists completely separate from your account and agent data setting those controls that require all three sets of data is absolutely difficult. And while integration may not be possible at one site, or it may be possible that you can get integration at one site, is it economically feasible at 2 sites, 3 sites, 10 sites, or God forbid, home-based agents? The answer for many is most likely no. That's why it's hard to drive change throughout your organization. You compliance executives, as you're trying to get that warm and fuzzy, if you're hitting a level of frustration, it might well be the traditional hardware-based network. Contact centers need to be able to quickly and cost-effectively integrate across many sites and many systems with resulting systems that scale and that they're easy to maintain and easy to audit. It's here that cloud's ability to simplify, unify, and centralize cost efficiently can be a powerful ally, and we'll see that on the next slide. With a cloud solution, you can create a virtual layer, pictured at the right, that pulls all your manual calls under the same compliance rules and into the same call recording system as your dialer and your collections management system or your CRM system. And the solution can be deployed virtually with no hardware purchases, no new equipment being shipped to various sites, no complex deployment project plans. Deploying from the cloud typically eliminates CapEx. It radically shrinks the time it takes you to deploy, and it leaves you with a system that has central controls and is scalable across any site or system. The first step to ensuring compliance is ensuring that you have full control over all contact center activities, including those manual dials. As Judy mentioned and Bev mentioned, the inability to do so may become a serious concern if approached by the CFPB. Let's take a look at another example. Call recording for inbound transfers and call escalations. We talked a little bit about these, and I didn't want to put Bev on the spot, but if she was out there picking her calls to monitor or to listen to the recordings, if she found calls that involved an escalation to a manager, which are typically problem calls, but there was no recording, you know, to me that's a red flag, and that triggers the chase instinct in any auditor. They want to look deeper. They want to look harder. Like manual dials on the PBX, due to that legacy fragmentation from hardware, these inbound calls and transfers are commonly not linked to the account management system or the agent data, and therefore can be very difficult to find and present in an audit trail. As with manual calls, the cloud layer can also be used to store these calls in a central secure depository accessible in real time. Making this thing work across multiple sites without a cloud layer is also a very expensive and time-consuming proposition. Without the cloud, traditionally with a hardware network, once it's set up, it's brittle. Changes in a brittle structure create cracks. Cracks breed compliance gaps. I can't speak for the CFPB, but since I believe their auditors will most resemble bank auditors, they'll consider easy access to call recordings that are logically associated with relevant accounts as a sign of transparency. If they can't find them, well, I think that's going to be a problem. That would be like a bank examiner not being able to find how you calculated and posted interest to an account. Because cloud can integrate a call recording application with other core applications, call recording can be automatically applied across all sites regardless of call originations. That includes manual calls, inbound calls, transfers, transfers offshore to onshore, onshore to offshore, and between sites. Again, very, very important calls that you actually are able to protect the integrity of the call recording. This provides a centralized, dynamically retrievable database of all call activity without the traditional capital cost of capital and also the integration and time costs. Next slide, please. So enabling monitoring through speech analytics, the same capability is available for monitoring. Speech analytics generated a lot of interest last year because of its ability to quickly identify possible violations and to quickly make sure script changes were used across the enterprise. As such, I believe agencies like the CFPB will continue to encourage, if not expect, contact centers to have speech analytics. Small dip samples from the ocean of calls may not be good enough, and you certainly can't boil the ocean of data without software. By the way, cloud has caused, again, when we're talking about speech analytics, just a point, cloud's caused a price point for speech analytics to plummet into the expected and the affordable range. But like all other applications, using legacy premise technology for speech analytics can be a daunting task across multi-site contact center environment. If you look at that example on the left that hurts your eyes and maybe you stop looking at it, if you're like most folks, there's little extra boxes added. That basically indicates deploying call recording and speech analytics as additional boxes, additional machines, additional points of integration and complexity. As with manual calls, inbound and transfers, the speech analytics can be linked into a multi-site environment via the cloud. A cloud deployment on top of a cloud-based call recording system would immediately make the cost and time to deploy much lower, while also ensuring that you truly have 100% of your calls recorded. While cloud may seem relatively new, that technology has been around for more than a decade. This changing compliance environment has showcased just how impactful this technology can be in providing the ability to adapt faster and lower cost than ever before. I'd like to turn this back over to Judy and or Bev because we put together some takeaways. And again, I know we're running a little bit over. Thank you guys for staying with us.
All right, I want to go through just a few takeaways. And first of all, every debt buyer, collection agency, and a collection attorney should assume that they will have direct or indirect supervision by the CFPB. It's not just what has been identified in the definition of larger participants. The other thing is every debt buyer, collection agency, collection attorney, they need a compliance department, and not a compliance department that's responsible for collection functions. And then the other thing is the CFPB's focus is on risk to customers, not on the profitability to the agency. So if you don't have the money to correctly staff a compliance management team, my recommendation is you consider getting out of the debt collection business altogether.
Thanks, Bev. The 3 points I'd like to make in summary, only when you have complete control can you ensure complete compliance management. Adapting is extremely difficult and costly with legacy-based architecture. As Bev just indicated, the bar for compliance has been radically raised, and it will be raised, I think, as the CFPB becomes smarter. And when I say smarter, I mean they're going to be auditing different agencies, and they're going to see things that they really like, and they'll expect that to be throughout the industry. So finding ways to be able to stay with that higher bar, maintain that higher bar for less cost is critically important. Cloud provides that, a cost-effective, flexible, and comprehensive platform that enables rapid implementation. At this point, I'd like to thank everybody for joining, and really a very, very special thanks to Judy and Bev for being on today's webinar. Ladies, it's absolutely a rare opportunity to have this kind of insight from Lord knows how many audits and transactions and things you guys have seen over the years. So I definitely thank you for sharing. We still have a number of people, actually 180 people still on the call. There's no penalty for running a little bit over if folks want to stay. Judy, Bev, are there any questions out there that you're just itching to answer?
Well, I was so worried about being on time. I didn't think we were going to be able to do any more of the questions. We did get quite a few that we have not been able to answer, so I think we'll work on trying to put some answers together. And one person actually asked if they can get a copy of the questions. So I think we'll try to put together a little follow-up that we can email out to people and see if we respond that way, because there are quite a few we didn't get to.
Okay, great. Hey, thanks, guys. And again, if you asked a question during this, we owe you an answer, and we will get that to you after the webinar. Again, thanks, everybody. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.